They taxed the light of foreign suns. Commander Eva Rostova stood on the bridge of the starship Arbitrator, her knuckles white against the cool metal of the command rail. Below the planet, Kalen spun a swirl of bruised purple and desperate green. Its people were dying not from war, but from paperwork. The Gathar hegemony called it a gratitude tithe, a bill for services not rendered for protection not sought. Kalen had refused the offer of vassalage, and now their orbital mirror arrays, the very technology that warmed their world, were being systematically dismantled piece by piece as payment. Rostova's orders were clear: observe, report, do not engage. But every clipped Gathar transmission, every flicker of a dying planetary grid, felt like a tightening knot in her chest. She knew this would not end with observation. It would end in a court of stars, a public inquiry, where every stolen watt of power would be counted. The hegemony's methods were insidious, a slow strangulation by legalese. They arrived as saviors offering advanced technology and system defense to fledgling worlds. The price was a simple signature on a complex treaty, a document riddled with clauses of perpetual obligation. Refuse their gift, and the Gathar would present a bill for the initial consultation, for the fuel spent reaching the system, for the very light of their starships gracing the planet's sky. They were cosmic predators cloaked in the robes of benevolent accountants. The Arbitrator was here because Kalen was the third world in this sector to face this extortion. Humanity's Starfleet had a mandate to uphold interstellar law, but the Gathar were masters of twisting it. Their law was a weapon of slow, perfectly documented annihilation. A civilian vignette flickered on a side monitor, a mother on Kalen huddling with her children, as the lights in their dwelling went out for the mandated brownout. They say the sun is a gift, she whispered to them, her voice trembling, but the collectors keep taking pieces of it away. Rostova muted the feed, her jaw tight. Fleet mind, she said, her voice low and steady. Give me the latest on the Gathar flagship, the Abacus of Souls. The ship's AI, a consciousness woven from the minds of 1,000 legal scholars and tacticians, responded instantly. Its synthesized voice was calm, a river of pure data. The Abacus maintains a high orbit position, Commander. They have just seized another quadrant of Kalen's solar mirror array, citing paragraph 3, subsection B of their default and reclamation doctrine. They are claiming payment for emotional distress caused by Kalen's ingratitude. Rostova's first officer, Lieutenant Jian Li, scoffed. Emotional distress, they're a race of sentient ledgers. What emotions could they possibly have? Jian was young, brilliant, and prone to righteous anger. She saw the injustice and wanted to meet it with firepower, a response Rostova understood but could not permit. Violence would only validate the Gathar's claims of aggression, handing them a legal victory on a silver platter. We had to win by their rules, or we wouldn't win at all. That's the point, Lieutenant Rostova said, turning from the viewport. They don't feel it. They quantify it. They've assigned a monetary value to a fabricated insult and are using it to justify planetary-scale theft. This was the core of their strategy, a mountain of fictitious debt legally unassailable without a precedent to challenge it. The Arbitrator was a vessel of the St. Hedwig class, a new breed of human ship designed for a new kind of war. It was less a battleship and more a mobile courthouse, its primary systems dedicated to data processing, secure communications, and the projection of legal arguments across entire systems. This fleet teaches by numbers and remembers by ledgers, never by collars. The ship's very existence was a statement of intent. Humanity had entered a galaxy where civilizations were conquered not by fleets but by clauses. And so humanity had forged its own weapons, unbreakable logic, irrefutable evidence, and the cold, hard math of justice. The universe would learn that a debt incurred must be a debt deserved. Fleet Mind Rostova continued begin a full-spectrum analysis of the Gathar Treaty. Every word, every comma. Cross-reference it with all known legal precedents in the Galactic Concordat. I want to find the crack in their armor. The AI's light pulsed softly on the main console. Analysis underway. Commander, initial probability of finding a direct contravention of existing law is 0.013%. The Gathar legal framework is robust. Rostova nodded. I'm not looking for a contravention. I'm looking for a hook. Something they overlooked, something so fundamentally absurd that even the most rigid tribunal can't ignore it. Her gaze drifted back to the dying planet below. They built their empire on the fine print, and in the fine print, they would be undone. The comms officer, Ensign Thorne, suddenly straightened in his seat. Commander, we're receiving a priority message from the Kalen Planetary Council. It's a surrender. The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Jian's face fell a mask of disbelief and frustration. They're giving up. Rostova felt a chill crawl up her spine. This was an escalation she hadn't anticipated. A surrender would legitimize the Gathar's claim, setting a devastating precedent. The gratitude tithe would no longer be a contested doctrine. It would be an accepted form of interstellar commerce. Put it on screen, Rostova commanded. A haggard Kalen official appeared, his face etched with defeat. We can no longer bear the cost. The Gathar have offered us terms. We will become a vassal state. The seizures will stop. Rostova leaned forward, her voice cutting through the silence. Counselor, this is Commander Rostova of the human starship Arbitrator. Do not sign that treaty. I repeat, do not sign. The Kalen looked up, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. Commander, we have no choice. Our people are freezing. Rostova's mind raced, searching for an angle, a legal gambit. The Gathar were listening, she knew it. They would be recording this, ready to file charges of interference. She had to phrase this perfectly. A new strategy was needed. One born of desperation and law. Counselor, she said, her tone precise and formal, under the Interstellar Mutual Aid Compact Article 7, a third party may offer to settle a debt to prevent a humanitarian crisis. We are formally requesting a full itemized invoice of Kalen's alleged debt from the Gathar hegemony. We intend to audit it. On the bridge of the Abacus of Souls, the Gathar proctor, a towering being of crystalline logic and fractal limbs, processed the human's transmission. Interference was expected. An audit, however, was a novel and potentially troublesome development. It was not a challenge to their authority, but a request for clarification. To refuse would be to admit their figures were arbitrary, a violation of their own meticulously crafted public image. To deny an audit was to confess the crime. The proctor conferred with its sub-minds for a fraction of a second. Acknowledge the human's request, it chimed its voice, a chorus of synthesized tones. Transmit the invoice. Let them see the perfect math of our gratitude. Back on the Arbitrator, the data began to pour in. It was a deluge, a weaponized blizzard of numbers and legalese. The invoice was a work of art, a monument to predatory accounting. There were charges for navigational advisory, cultural contamination risk assessment, and preemptive defense posture maintenance. Each item was backed by pages of dense circular logic. They're burying us in data, Jian said, her eyes wide as she scanned the figures. The energy cost to even process this invoice is astronomical. Rostova saw the trap immediately. They were being billed for the right to read the bill. Every query, every calculation would add to the debt. It was brilliant. It was monstrous, Fleetmind Rostova said, her voice calm. Isolate the single largest line item on that invoice. The AI processed for a moment. That would be the charge for stewardship of local star commander. They have calculated the total energy output of Kalen's sun over a 100-year period and are charging a 1% stewardship fee for not having blocked it. Jian swore under her breath. That's insane. How can you tax a star? Rostova allowed herself a grim smile. You can't, but you can charge for the service of not interfering with it. This was it. The hook. The point of absurdity she had been searching for. It was a charge so unaudacious, so fundamentally illogical, that it could be turned against them. They had finally overreached their greed, outstripping their caution. Before the next set piece, another civilian vignette played out in Rostova's mind, a memory from a past encounter. A child on a world recently liberated by the Gathar looked up at their ship in the sky and asked her mother, "Does that ship own the stars now?" The question had haunted Rostova for years. Now she had an answer. "Ensign Thorn," she commanded. "Open a system-wide channel. Unencrypted. I want everyone to hear this, especially the Gathar." Thorn's fingers flew across his console. "Channel open, Commander." Rostova took a deep breath. It was time to start the inquiry right here, right now, in the court of public opinion. This is Commander Rostova of the human starship Arbitrator, addressing the Gathar hegemony vessel Abacus of Souls. Her voice echoed across the system, reaching Kalen's council, the Gathar bridge, and any listening posts within range. "We are in receipt of your invoice on behalf of the planet Kalen. We have a point of clarification regarding the charge for stewardship of local star. Please confirm the methodology used to calculate this fee." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "Specifically, we require you to demonstrate the mechanism by which you would have blocked Kalen's sun had this fee not been levied." The question was a spear aimed at the heart of their legal fiction. To answer was to admit to a capability they did not possess or to confess to threatening planetary-scale destruction. To refuse to answer was to invalidate the largest charge on their invoice. The proctor on the Abacus felt a flicker of something its processors could only label as irritation. The human was clever. She was not challenging the legality of the fee, but the practicality of the service it represented. It was a masterful piece of legal maneuvering. The Gathar's entire system was built on the assumption that no one would dare to question the underlying premise of their power. They sold the shadow of the gun, not the gun itself. Now this human was demanding to see the weapon. The proctor had to respond carefully. A direct lie was inefficient and could be disproven. A refusal was an admission of weakness. It chose a third option, obfuscation. "The mechanisms of hegemonic stewardship are proprietary," the proctor chimed, its voice smooth and unbothered. "Our ability to manage stellar output is a cornerstone of our defensive and benevolent services. To detail it would be a security risk." It was a weak answer, and they both knew it. Rostova pressed her advantage. "We are not asking for technical schematics, Proctor. We are asking for a simple confirmation of capability. Did you or do you possess the means to dim Kalen's star as a punitive measure?" Every word was chosen to be as precise and as damning as possible. She was boxing them in, forcing them to either commit to a monstrous threat or abandon their claim. The law was a mirror, and she was forcing them to look in it. Jian watched the exchange, her earlier anger replaced by a dawning sense of awe. This was a battle of words, a duel of logic, but the stakes were just as high as any firefight. Rostova wasn't trying to outfight the Gathar. She was forcing them to outthink themselves, to fall into the traps of their own convoluted doctrines. Fleetmind Rostova said, her eyes never leaving the main screen, begin compiling a public ledger. Entry 1. The Gathar hegemony has levied a charge for a service they refuse to define. Entry 2. The Gathar hegemony implicitly claims the ability to manipulate stellar output as a means of debt collection. Distribute this ledger to every concordant member world and every neutral news agency in this quadrant. A new front had opened not in space but in the realm of reputation. The proctor felt a new sensation, a cold cascade of logic that approximated alarm. The human was not just arguing, she was building a case. A public ledger distributed and archived across the galaxy was a permanent record. It was a stain that could not be easily wiped away. Their power relied on a perception of legitimacy, a carefully constructed image of order and law. The human was painting them as extortionists, as bullies who threatened to turn off the sun. And she was doing it using their own words. The truth once spoken could not be unspoken. The Gathar had always controlled the narrative. Now, for the first time, they were losing that control. Commander Fleetmind interjected its calm voice, a counterpoint to the rising tension. I have completed my analysis of the Gathar Treaty framework. I have found an anomaly. Rostova turned her attention to the AI. What is it? It is not in the clauses themselves, but in the metadata. Every Gathar treaty contains a hidden gratitude index, a variable that algorithmically determines the value of their benevolence. This index is pegged to the recipient world's own economic and technological growth. The more a world develops, the higher its debt becomes. It is a system designed to ensure perpetual servitude. It was the final piece of the puzzle. The Gathar weren't just collecting a debt. They were punishing success. They didn't want payment. They wanted control. Rostova felt a cold fury settle over her. It was worse than she had imagined. The Gathar were parasites feeding on the very ambition and progress of the worlds they claimed to be helping. Fleetmind, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Can you project the gratitude index for Kalen over the next 50 years, assuming they become a vassal state? The AI displayed a graph on the main screen. It was a chilling curve rising exponentially until it consumed the planet's entire projected GDP. Vassalage was not a path to stability. It was a slow, calculated execution. Add it to the ledger, Rostova ordered. Headline: The Gathar Gratitude Tithe is not a debt. It is a death sentence. The mask was off the monster revealed. On the Abacus, the proctor saw the public ledger entry appear on its monitors, distributed by the powerful human ship. The graph was undeniable, derived from their own hidden code. The human hadn't just found a crack. She had shattered their entire legal foundation. The charge of taxing the sun was embarrassing. The revelation of the gratitude index was catastrophic. It exposed their entire business model as a fraudulent scheme of cosmic proportions. The proctor now faced a choice: retreat and cut its losses, or double down and silence the source of the revelation. For a creature of pure logic, the decision was simple. The arbitrator and its commander were a threat to the hegemony's existence. A threat to the system must be eliminated by the system. Commander Ensign Thorne called out, his voice tense. The Abacus is powering weapons. Jian's hand instinctively went to the tactical console. Shields up, she ordered. Rostova held up a hand. Belay that order, Lieutenant. Jian stared at her, incredulous. Commander, they're going to fire on us, yes. Rostova replied, her eyes fixed on the Gathar ship. And we're going to let them. This was the ultimate gambit, the final desperate move in a game of legal chess. A first strike against a neutral vessel, especially one engaged in a formal legal inquiry, was a flagrant violation of every treaty in the Concordat. It was an act of galactic war. If they fired, they would lose everything. A civilian on Kalen, huddled around a public screen, watched the exchange with bated breath. He saw the human commander's ship, smaller outgunned, standing firm against the colossal Jathar vessel. He saw the charge of taxing the sun, the damning graph of their future. For the first time in months, he felt a spark of something other than despair. It was a fragile, dangerous thing called hope. The humans weren't fighting for them with weapons. They were fighting for them with the truth. "They have to fire," he whispered to the person next to him. "It's the only way they can lose." Around them, the crowd watched in silence as the weapon ports on the Abacus of Souls glowed with lethal energy. Fleet-mind Rostova said, her voice a calm island in a sea of tension, record everything. Every energy spike, every weapons lock. Send it all to the public ledger in real time. The AI complied without a word. The arbitrator stood its ground, its shields down, a silent testament to its commander's faith in the power of law over the power of plasma. Rostova was making a statement: we are not warriors, we are arbiters, and we will not be moved by threats. The Gathar were being given a final choice. They could abandon their claim and retreat, their reputation in tatters, or they could fire and become galactic pariahs. A moment of choice with the fate of an empire hanging in the balance. The energy readings from the Abacus peaked. The ship's fractal hull shimmered as its weapon systems reached full charge. Jian held her breath, her hand hovering over the shield controls, every instinct screaming at hers to defy the commander's order. Thorn gripped his console, his face pale. On the main screen, the image of the Gathar ship was a portrait of imminent violence. Rostova watched, her expression unreadable. She had built a cage of logic and law around the proctor. Now she would see if the beast would choose to rattle its bars or tear them and itself apart. The universe held its breath, waiting for the verdict. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, the energy signatures vanished. The weapon ports on the Abacus went dark. A new message arrived, not on a public channel, but a direct encrypted link to the arbitrator. It contained a single document. It was a formal retraction of the invoice sent to Kalen. It was a notice of withdrawal from the Kalen system. It was a surrender. The proctor had made its calculation. The cost of firing was higher than the cost of retreat. The logic was inescapable. A battle won not with a shot, but with a sentence. Jian let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. A cheer went up from the bridge crew. Relief washed over them, palpable and profound. Rostova allowed herself a small, tight smile. "They're running," Jian said, a grin spreading across her face. "They're actually running." Rostova shook her head. "They're not running, Lieutenant. They're recalculating. They've lost this battle, but they haven't lost the war. They will adapt. They will find new ways to exploit, new loopholes to twist." She turned to face her crew. "This isn't over. It's just the beginning. We've shown them that humanity is not just another species to be billed into submission. We've shown them that our laws have teeth." Her words hung in the air, a promise and a warning. On Kalen, the news of the Gathar's withdrawal was met with stunned disbelief, then riotous celebration. The lights began to come back on as the orbital mirrors were returned to planetary control. The mother from the vignette hugged her children, tears streaming down her face as the warm glow filled their home once more. The sun, it seemed, was free again. But the counselor who had almost surrendered knew better. It was a temporary reprieve, a victory bought by a clever human commander. He looked up at the star-dusted sky, at the small, determined human ship that had stood watch over his world. "They had shown us a path, but we would have to walk it ourselves." Aboard the arbitrator, Rostova watched the Abacus of Souls warp out of the system. The immediate crisis was over, but the larger conflict loomed. The Gathar hegemony was a vast, ancient power. They would not take this humiliation lightly. They would come back smarter, more ruthless. Rostova knew that the public ledger, the inquiry she had initiated, was not just a tactic. It was now her primary weapon. She had to expand it to build a case so strong, so irrefutable, that the entire Galactic Concordat would have no choice but to act. She needed to put the Gathar's entire way of life on trial. This was no longer about a single planet. It was about the soul of interstellar law. Fleet mind. She said, her voice ringing with a new sense of purpose. Begin a new file. Title it, The Case Against Hegemony. I want every piece of data we have on the Gathar, every treaty, every tithe, every world they have ever assisted. We are going to build a mirror so large that when they look into it, they will see nothing but the monster they have become. The AI's light glowed a steady, reassuring blue. Compiling Commander. The task is monumental. Rostova nodded. I know. But justice is a monumental task, and it's a debt we owe to every world that has suffered in silence. The ledger was no longer just a record. It was a reckoning. The ship hummed around her, a quiet symphony of purpose. Her crew was energized, their morale higher than it had been in months. They had faced down a superior foe, and won not with torpedoes, but with truth. They had seen the power of their unique mission, the strength of their unconventional weapons. Jian came to stand beside her, her earlier anger replaced by a quiet respect. What's our next move? Commander Rostova looked at the star chart, at the vast expanse of space where the Gathar's influence spread like a cancer. Our next move, she said, is to find another Kalen, and another, and another. We will follow the trail of their greed, and at every stop we will hold up our mirror and force them to see their own reflection. It was a war of 1,000 small cuts, each one a legal precedent, each one a step towards justice. A week later, the arbitrator arrived in the Xylos system. A different species, the gentle insectoid Xylans, faced a different but equally predatory Gathar doctrine, the collar of fealty. It was a technology gifted to the Xylan leaders, a device that monitored their biosigns and administered pleasure or pain based on their compliance with Gathar directives. It was slavery by another name, a technological leash wrapped in the language of partnership. The Xylans had accepted it willingly, believing it was a tool for societal harmony. Now they were trapped, their every decision dictated by the whims of their off-world masters. A vignette played on Rostova's private screen. A Xylan artist tries to carve a statue of defiance, only to collapse in agony as his collar activates, enforcing the cultural homogeneity clause of his people's treaty. The Gathar presence here was more subtle. No warship loomed in orbit, just a small administrative station, a quiet, sterile outpost that monitored the collars and collected the tithes. The Gathar had learned from their encounter in the Kalen system. They were avoiding overt threats and grand, absurd invoices. They were relying on the insidious, silent control of the collars. This would be a different kind of fight. Rostova couldn't simply audit a bill or question a capability. She had to challenge the very definition of consent. She had to prove that a choice made under duress was not a choice at all. Fleet-mind Rostova began her strategic mind already mapping out the new legal battlefield. I want a complete analysis of the collar of fealty. Its technical specifications, its neurological effects, and most importantly, the legal framework under which it was presented to the Xylans. The AI's voice filled the bridge. The collar operates on the principle of incentivized compliance. It does not override free will, but rather provides strong encouragement. The Gathar argue that it is a tool for self-governance, a way for the Xylans to adhere to the treaty they signed. It was another legal masterpiece of evil. The Callers didn't force obedience. They just made disobedience excruciating. The pain was the point, and the contract was the excuse. Jian stared at the data readouts, her fists clenched. So they're torturing them into compliance and calling it a training aid, precisely, Rostova said. And the Xylans agreed to it. That's the Gathar's defense. They will claim the Xylans entered into the contract as a sovereign people. This was the new escalation, a more insidious form of control that was harder to fight. The Gathar were adapting. They were moving from overt extortion to covert subjugation. They had traded the accountant's pen for the jailer's key. So how do we fight this? Jian asked. We can't just ask them to turn off the Callers. No, Rostova agreed. We can't. But we can challenge the validity of the contract itself. Under Concordat law, a treaty can be nullified if one party can be proven to have been fundamentally incapable of understanding the terms. It was a long shot, a difficult legal argument to make. The Gathar would have records logs, even hollow recordings of the Xylans agreeing to the terms. Rostova needed more than just a legal theory. She needed a witness. She needed a Xylan to testify, to describe the experience of the caller, to show the galactic community that this was not partnership, but technologically enforced torment. And she needed to do it without getting that witness killed by their own neckwear. Ensign Thorn Rostova ordered, "Find me a crack in the Gathar's local network. I need a secure, untraceable line to the surface directly to the Xylan Leadership Council." Thorn's fingers danced across his console. The Gathar network was formidable, but the arbitrator was designed for this kind of work. After a tense few minutes, a small green light blinked on his screen. "I'm in, Commander. It's a fragile link, but it's secure." Rostova nodded. "Patch it through to my ready room. It's time I had a conversation with the Xylan Elder." This was the first move in the new game. She had to convince a people who had been conditioned to obey that their only hope lay in an act of ultimate defiance. A single voice of truth could shatter a system of lies. The Xylan Elder appeared on her screen, a frail, elegant creature whose chitinous plates were dull with age and sorrow. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were constantly fighting an unseen force. He was afraid. The collar around his neck was a subtle silver band, almost beautiful. "Commander Rostova," he chirped, his voice a series of soft clicks and whistles that the universal translator rendered into perfect, weary English. "We had hoped you would come. But we do not know what you can do. We are bound by our word, by the contract." Rostova leaned forward, her expression a mixture of empathy and resolve. "Elder, a contract signed without full comprehension of the consequences is not a contract. It is a trap. I believe the Gathar exploited your people's trust. A single doubt planted in the right mind could grow into a revolution." The Elder's mandibles trembled. To speak against the Gathar, to even think it. The collar. He flinched, a spasm of pain crossing his features. The pain is a powerful argument for compliance. Rostova's heart ached for him, but she could not back down. "I have a way," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial. "My ship's AI can create a buffer, a small window of time, where your caller's punitive response can be delayed. It would only be a few minutes, but it would be enough. Enough for you to speak the truth, to testify before a public inquiry." She was asking him to endure unimaginable pain, to walk through fire for the chance of freedom. It was a terrible thing to ask, but the alternative was a terrible thing to live. "We need to compel a public inquiry," Rostova explained, laying out her plan. To do that, we need to file a formal grievance with the Concordat, and that grievance needs a primary witness. You, Elder. You would need to make a statement, a formal accusation against the Gathar. Once the grievance is filed, the Gathar cannot legally retaliate against you without violating Concordat protocols. They would be forced to answer the charge in an open forum. It was a corridor of law gambit, a legal maneuver that used the system's own rules to force an unwilling participant into the open. The law designed to protect could also be used to expose. The elder was silent for a long moment, the weight of his people's future on his frail shoulders. The risk was immense. If they failed, the Gathar's retribution would be swift and terrible. But if they succeeded, they could be free. The pain. It teaches us not to hope, he whispered. Hope is a forbidden thought. Rostova's voice was soft, but laced with steel. Then let us teach them a new lesson. Let us teach them what happens when a people who have forgotten how to hope are reminded of what it feels like to be free. She saw a flicker in the elder's multifaceted eyes, a spark of the defiance he had buried long ago. A leader's courage is the flame that lights the path for his people. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. We will do it. We will speak. The decision was made. The first step on a dangerous new path had been taken. Rostova felt a surge of adrenaline. The stakes were higher now, the enemy more insidious. But the principle was the same. The Gathar had built an empire on the twisting of words, on the perversion of law. And with words with law, she would tear it down. Fleetmind, she said, turning back to the bridge, prepare the buffer program. And get ready to file the grievance. The Court of the Stars is now in session. The universe was about to hear the testimony of a slave, and the Gathar would be forced to listen. The plan moved with digital speed. Fleetmind devised a program that would intercept the caller's signal to the Gathar station, creating a microsecond delay. It was a digital sleight of hand, a fleeting moment of freedom. The Xylan elder, surrounded by his council, prepared to make his statement. It would be broadcast live, piggybacking on the arbitrator's powerful transmitters sent directly to the Concordat's public inquiry channels. It was a legal ambush. By the time the Gathar realized what was happening, the elder's testimony would be on the permanent record. They were using the speed of light as a shield and a sword. The link is live, Commander Thorne reported, his voice tight. On the main screen, the image of the Xylan elder appeared. He looked small, frail, but his eyes burned with a newfound fire. He took a deep, shuddering breath. I am Elder Chakar of the Xylan people. He began, his translated voice echoing across the bridge. I speak to you today not as a partner of the Gathar hegemony, but as their prisoner. He had barely finished the sentence when his body seized a silent scream contorting his features. The Gathar had reacted faster than anticipated. The caller was flooding his system with agony. Pain was their first and last argument, Fleetmind. What's happening? Jian demanded. The buffer isn't holding. The AI's voice was clipped, urgent. The Gathar are using a quantum-entangled communication relay. There is no travel time to intercept. The punitive signal is instantaneous. The gambit had failed. The elder was being tortured live on an open channel for the entire quadrant to see. Rostova's blood ran cold. This was a disaster. But then she saw it. The elder, even as his body writhed in agony, was still speaking. He was forcing the words out, one terrible, pain-laced syllable at a time. The caller is not a guide. It is a cage. His will was stronger than their technology. He was a martyr testifying from his own cross, and the entire galaxy was watching. The Gathar, in their haste to silence him, had overplayed their hand. They were not just controlling a subject. They were publicly torturing a head of state. It was a public relations catastrophe of their own making. Keep the channel open. Rostova commanded, her voice like ice. Let everyone see it. Let them see the true face of the gratitude tithe. She turned to Fleetmind. File the grievance. Now. Charge public torture of a sovereign leader during a diplomatic address. Cite Concordat Code 1117. Sanctity of diplomatic speech. The crime was the evidence, the victim the witness. The Gathar on the local station realized their mistake too late. They cut the feed from the collar, and the elder collapsed, gasping but alive. The damage was done. The recording of his testimony of his torture was already archived, already copied 1,000,000 times over. The formal grievance from the arbitrator was logged a bright red flag on the Concordat's public docket. The Gathar were now legally compelled to respond. They had been drawn into the open not by a clever legal argument, but by their own brutality. Their cruelty had become their own undoing. A new message arrived from the Abacus of Souls, which had just warped back into the Xylos system, a giant angry hornet returning to its nest. The proctor's voice was no longer smooth and condescending. It was cold, sharp, a shard of glass. Commander Rostova, you have committed a grave error. You have interfered in the internal affairs of a sovereign hegemony partner. You have incited insurrection. These are acts of war. Rostova met the proctor's threat with a calm she did not feel. I have filed a legal grievance, proctor, supported by evidence. The Concordat will convene a public inquiry. You will be required to attend and to answer the charges. The law was now her shield, and it was a shield they could not break. The Concordat is a relic, the proctor chimed. Its laws are suggestions. Our laws are mathematical certainties. You and your ship are now in violation of hegemonic space. You will power down your systems and prepare to be boarded, or we will dismantle you piece by piece and add your salvage value to the Xylan's debt. The threat was clear. The Gathar were abandoning the pretense of law and resorting to naked force. This was the final escalation. The legal battle was about to become a physical one, and the arbitrator was hopelessly outgunned. A court of law was about to become a field of battle. Jian's hand flew to the tactical console, her face a grim mask. Commander, their weapon ports are open. They are not bluffing. Rostova's gaze remained locked on the looming form of the Abacus of Souls. The Gathar had decided that the law was no longer a useful tool. It was an obstacle to be removed. She had hoped to win in the courtroom of galactic opinion, but the proctor was moving the trial to a battlefield of its own choosing. A battlefield where the only law was the strength of your shields. Commander Rostova, the proctor's voice boomed across the open channel, a final cold pronouncement. Your continued existence is a mathematical error. We are here to correct the equation. Around Rostova, her bridge crew stood frozen, their training warring with the primal instinct to brace for impact. They were a ship of law facing a vessel of overwhelming force. The fight was unwinnable by any conventional metric. Fleetmind Rostova said, her voice cutting through the tension, perfectly level. What is the Concordat penalty for destroying a neutral vessel that has filed a formal grievance and is awaiting a public inquiry? The question itself was a weapon. A reminder that some actions have consequences beyond mere physics. The AI's response was immediate broadcast on the same open channel for the Gathar to hear. The penalty is censure level Omega. It entails the immediate and permanent revocation of all treaty rights, the voiding of all active contracts, and the forfeiture of all legal standing within the Concordat. The offending party's methods are declared lex non grata, an outlaw doctrine. They would cease to be a recognized galactic power. They would become pirates. The information settled over the two bridges. The Gathar could destroy the arbitrator, but in doing so, they would destroy the legal foundation of their entire empire. They could win the battle and lose everything. Their greatest strength, their mastery of law, had become their cage. An empty threat, the proctor hissed, but a flicker of uncertainty rippled through its synthesized voice. It was used to calculating financial cost, not existential ruin. The Concordat is slow. By the time they act, this system will be a sanitized asset of the hegemony. Rostova saw her opening. The proctor believed it could control the flow of information, that it could erase the crime before the verdict was delivered. Fleetmind, she commanded, begin a live system-wide broadcast of this standoff. Title it, Exhibit A for the Public Inquiry of the Gathar Hegemony. Every ship, every station, every planetary settlement in this quadrant will be a witness. A new jury was being impaneled, and their judgment would be instantaneous. Ensign Thorne's fingers flew. Broadcasting live, Commander. We have thousands of confirmed observer nodes. The feed is spreading. The Gathar were no longer threatening a lone human ship in the dark. They were threatening to commit a capital crime in front of an audience of the entire galaxy. The Abacus of Souls did not power down its weapons, but it did not fire. It held its position, a predator frozen mid-strike, suddenly aware of the eyes upon it. The proctor was recalculating the cold math of risk and reward, shifting beneath its feet. To fire was to confess. To stand down was to concede. Proctor Rostova said, pressing her advantage, her voice resonating with the quiet authority of someone who knew the law was on her side. The inquiry is proceeding. Your presence is required. You can either attend as a participant, or your silence and hostility will be entered into the record as an admission of guilt. She was offering them a way out, a chance to return to the legal battlefield where they believed they were strongest. It was a humiliating climb down, but it was better than the alternative. After a long, tense silence, the weapon ports on the Abacus slowly, reluctantly closed. The threat of the law had proven more powerful than the threat of the gun. The public inquiry was a strange affair, a trial held across light years. The arbitrator served as the prosecution's nexus, its holographic displays showing the faces of concordant arbiters from a dozen different worlds. The proctor of the Abacus of Souls represented the Gathar, its crystalline form shimmering with barely contained indignation. The key witnesses, the Xylan Elder and the Kalan Counselor, gave their testimony from their own beleaguered worlds. A civilian vignette appeared in Rostova's mind, a Xylan family watching the proceedings on a public screen, their silver collars gleaming under the dim light, their hope a fragile, flickering candle. They watched to see if the galaxy cared enough to break their chains. Rostova presented her case with cold, methodical precision. She played the recording of the Gathar invoice to Kalan, highlighting the absurd charge for stewardship of their own son. She displayed Fleetmind's analysis of the gratitude index, showing the inescapable mathematical certainty of economic ruin. Finally, and most damningly, she played the unedited recording of the Xylan Elder's address of his quiet defiance, followed by his technologically induced agony. The evidence was overwhelming, a digital mountain of proof against the hegemony's practices. The truth did not need embellishment. It only needed a voice. The proctor's defense was as brilliant as it was chilling. It did not deny the facts. It recontextualized them. The gratitude tithe is not extortion. It chimed, its voice resonating with an unshakable self-assurance. It is a motivational tool. We present developing worlds with a bill for their own potential, encouraging them to strive for greatness to pay it off. It is a gift of ambition. It was a monstrous twisting of logic, framing a crushing weight as a helping hand. The hegemony did not see itself as a predator. It saw itself as a teacher, and suffering was its greatest lesson. Then it addressed the callers. The Xylans consented to the collar of fealty. It is a device of self-regulation, a tool to help them honor the contract they willingly signed. The discomfort it generates is not torture. It is a corrective stimulus, a biofeedback mechanism. We are not punishing them. We are helping them keep their word. The proctor's argument was seamless, devoid of emotion, and within its own terrifying framework, perfectly logical. It was arguing that freedom included the freedom to choose slavery, and that a contract once signed was more sacred than the well-being of those who signed it. Law without empathy is just a formula for tyranny. One of the arbiters, a vast silicon-based life form, whose thoughts manifested as shimmering light patterns, posed a question. Proctor, if your methods are so benevolent, why are they so universally feared? Why must you enforce gratitude with pain and ambition with debt? The proctor's response was instantaneous. Because the universe is a place of costs. Growth has a cost. Order has a cost. Our clients simply do not wish to pay their bills. We are not the aggressors here. We are the collectors of a debt that is both freely incurred and legally binding. It was the core of their philosophy, the engine of their empire. And in a galaxy built on contracts and commerce, it was a dangerously compelling argument. The most insidious lies are wrapped in a kernel of truth. Rostova knew she was losing. The arbiters were creatures of law. The proctor was speaking their language. She was arguing for morality, for the spirit of the law, while the proctor was arguing for the letter of it. She needed something more. She needed to break not just their argument, but their entire system. Fleet mind, she whispered, her voice inaudible to the inquiry. Is it ready? The AI's light on her console pulsed once. It is, Commander. But the risks are substantial. To execute, we will need to divert all power from shields and tactical systems. We will be completely exposed, and the data intrusion required violates several Concordat privacy statutes. The only way to enforce the law was to break it. This was the cost of victory she had foreseen. To save the Xylans and Kalen, she would have to commit a crime herself, a black mark on her own perfect record. And she would have to render her ship utterly defenseless in the face of an enemy who had already proven its willingness to use force. Do it, she said. Jian, standing at the tactical station, overheard the command. Commander, are you sure the Abacus is still out there? They'll see our power drop. Rostova met her first officer's worried gaze. I know, but some things are worth the risk. She turned back to the inquiry. Arbiters, Proctor. The Gathar speak of costs and ledgers. Let us for a moment examine their own. It was time for the final reckoning, the mirror justice she had promised. Fleet mind. She commanded, her voice ringing out across the bridge and the inquiry. Execute command Rostova Gamma. Project the true ledger. Mirror all accounts. The lights on the arbitrator's bridge dimmed the hum of the engines, dropping to a whisper as the ship's massive power core rerouted its entire output to the central processing unit and the communication arrays. The ship fell silent, a ghost in the void, its defenses gone. On the main screen, the feed of the inquiry was replaced by a swirling vortex of data, a river of numbers and symbols that resolved into a vast, intricate web. A web of lies. The data had been gathered from the Gathar's own invoice, from the hidden code of the Gratitude Index, from the metadata of their treaty frameworks. Fleetmind had used these threads to weave a key that had unlocked the Gathar's most secret database, their own internal accounting system. The arbitrator was now broadcasting this system for the entire galaxy to see. And it was a fraud. It showed that while the Gathar presented a united front of cold, hard math to their clients, their internal economy was a chaotic mess of shell corporations, embezzled tithes, and falsified reports. Proctor was cheating Proctor, and the entire hegemony was a house of cards built on bad faith. A civilization built on the sanctity of numbers was being undone by the numbers themselves. On the bridge of the Abacus, the Proctor watched in stunned silence as its empire's secrets were laid bare. The perfect math it had spoken of was a lie. Its own tithe collections from the Xylo system were being siphoned off by a superior Proctor in another sector. Its own position of power was based on figures it now saw were fabricated. The human ship hadn't just presented evidence. It had presented a mirror, and the reflection was a monster of the Gathar's own making. The human commander had returned the cost. The price of their lies was the truth. The ledger was a weapon, and it was aimed at the heart of the voltages Boamonsi. The Proctor's cold logic fractured. Its primary directive was the prosperity of the hegemony. But the hegemony was a fiction, a lie it had unknowingly served. Its rage, a cold quantum fury, focused on the source of this revelation. The arbitrator was vulnerable, its power signatures at near zero. A single decisive strike could erase this humiliation. Fire. The Proctor chimed its voice, a discordant mess of conflicting directives. Fire all weapons. Erase the error. The Gathar ship, reacting to the direct command of its master, began to power its main cannon. A lance of pure energy enough to atomize the unshielded arbitrator began to form at its prow. The beast was lashing out even as the cage of logic collapsed around it. Commander Jian yelled, her hands flying over a dead console. Energy spike! They're firing! Rostova watched the Gathar ship, her face impassive. She had known this was a possibility, a final spiteful act from a dying system. She had bet everything on the power of the law, but now, in the final moment, it seemed that violence would have the last word. The price of victory was about to be paid in full. The ship shuddered as a stray bolt of energy from the forming Gathar weapon struck a forward sensor mast. Ensign Thorne cried out as his console exploded, showering him in sparks and shrapnel. A cost had been incurred, paid in blood and steel, but the main blast never came. As the Gathar weapon reached peak charge, a smaller Gathar vessel, a patrol ship that had been on the edge of the system, suddenly swerved and fired its own torpedoes. Not at the arbitrator, but at the Abacus of souls. The torpedoes struck the larger ship's primary weapon emitter, causing a catastrophic feedback loop. The Abacus shuddered its energy lance, collapsing into a blinding flash of light that harmlessly dissipated into the void. On the arbitrator's bridge, everyone stared in stunned silence. A Gathar ship had fired on its own flagship. Fleetmind's voice cut through the confusion. The mirrored ledger has been received by all hegemony assets in this sector, Commander. It appears the captain of the patrol vessel, upon discovering that the proctor of the Abacus had been falsifying its reports and stealing from his own operational budget, made a new calculation of loyalty. The mirror had not just shown the truth to the galaxy, it had shown it to the Gathar themselves, and their reaction, based on pure, cold, self-interested logic, was to turn on each other. Rostova's gambit had worked better than she could have ever imagined. She had not destroyed the hegemony. She had given it the tools to destroy itself. The Abacus of souls, damaged and betrayed, turned its back on the battle it had started. Its allegiance was no longer to the hegemony but to itself. It warped out of the system not in retreat, but in pursuit of its own internal vendetta. The patrol ship followed a moment later. The Xylo system was for the first time in decades free of its masters. The inquiry was over. The Gathar had not even bothered to offer a closing statement. Their case had evaporated along with their credibility. Silence reigned, the quiet hum of the arbitrator's systems slowly returning as power was restored to the bridge. The reckoning was complete. Medics rushed to tend to Ensign Thorne, whose injuries were serious but not life-threatening. The damage to the ship was cosmetic, a scar it would wear as a badge of honor. Rostova walked over to the tactical station, where Jian was watching the last of the Gathar ships vanish from the sensors. "You knew they would turn on each other," Jian said, her voice full of awe. "I didn't know," Rostova admitted, "but I knew they were creatures of logic. I simply gave them a new, more accurate set of numbers to work with." She had held up a mirror, and they had shattered themselves against it. A victory of math over math. Days later, the final verdict from the Concordate inquiry arrived. It was swift and unanimous. On the main screen, the official public ledger entry blinked into existence, a permanent, unchangeable fixture in the annals of galactic law. Rostova read the words, a quiet satisfaction, settling deep in her bones. The cost had been high: a wounded crewman, a damaged ship, a permanent censure on her own record for the data intrusion. But the prize was immeasurable, a tangible cost for an intangible, infinite gain. It was a price she would pay again without hesitation. She stood on her bridge, the quiet hum of the ship, a familiar comfort. The scent of ozone from Thorne's burned-out console still lingered in the recycled air, a sensory reminder of the battle they had won. Her work was not done. The Gathar hegemony was vast, and its collapse would create a power vacuum. There would be other predators, other tyrants who used the law as a weapon. But now there was a precedent. Now there was a new kind of weapon in the arsenal of justice. The public ledger entry blinked its cool, immutable text, a beacon in the dark. Precedent lock. The doctrine known as the gratitude tithe is hereby declared legally void, its methods predatory and unenforceable. The doctrine of the collar of fealty is ruled a violation of the sovereign will mandate, and its use is classified as an act of slavery. All existing contracts under these doctrines are nullified. The Gathar hegemony's voting privileges within the Concordat are suspended indefinitely. Rostova looked out at the stars, at the endless expanse of worlds that still needed a voice, that still needed a shield. The law was not just a set of rules, it was a promise. A promise that even in the vast, cold darkness of space there was a place for reason, a place for justice. And that promise, unlike a Gathar contract, was one worth keeping. The debt is paid.